Welcome to the Gottesdienst crowd, where we foster confessional integrity, liturgical preservation, and preaching that doesn't stink. We believe that the historic liturgy of the divine service is more than mere cobwebs of antiquity, but it is a true treasure of the Church to be dusted off and brought down from her attic to be enjoyed. So let's get dusting.
Hello and welcome to the Gottesdienst podcast. This is Paul Schultz. I am a pastor in Northwest Iowa, doing a little bit of fill-in work here for Jason Broughton that he asked me to cover because he's quite busy with some other things at this point in life. And so we have some interesting topics. I figured that since the Gottesdienst podcast tagline includes that we want to promote preaching that is good and honorable and just wonderful, that we all probably need to improve. And I was thinking about who to have on to discuss that. And I thought it would be good to have Pastor Zelwyn Heide on, who is probably familiar to many people who listen to the Gottesdienst podcast already. He is a pastor in North Dakota, in the North Dakota District. And I knew that he has done quite a bit of reading in various non-LCMS preaching resources. And so what we're hoping to do today is just have a discussion about how to find these resources, how to use them, how to examine them, and really how to get some fruit out of non-LCMS preaching advice that maybe some of us are not previously aware of, and that could help us all do our job just a little bit better. So, Pastor Heide, welcome.
Glad to be on with you. I'm honored to be able to come on and talk about this subject, and I pray that the discussion today will bear much fruit.
Awesome. So I'll just kind of let you get us going, and we'll see how it goes.
That sounds fine. Yeah, so as you were mentioning in the introduction, I have been fairly interested in, I guess you could say, the art of preaching for some time, because I think, like most pastors, you want to get good at preaching, right? You want to preach the very best that you can, and you want to do it to the fullest of your ability. But sometimes you're just kind of wondering, well, how do I go about doing that? How am I actually going to improve? And you want to try to figure out, well, how's that going to happen? And so that kind of started a lifelong interest in the topic, and it brought me to a variety of resources that we can talk about at some length, I guess, in the course of this conversation. But I mean, would you agree that we definitely want to aim at trying to improve?
I have the dream that every LCMS preacher is kind of the best known in his community for, even if you don't agree with his doctrine, you know, you're excited to maybe go to a funeral at his church because you're going to get a good sermon.
Sure.
I think that's a good, noble reputation for us to aim for.
I've noticed that at funerals too, because sometimes you'll, maybe not so much from other, people who are coming in, but sometimes members of your church will say, I always enjoy going to a funeral at a Missouri Synod church because you're going to hear the gospel, right?
Right.
You know that you're going to hear about Jesus, and that is such an important comfort. The thing that I think is important to remember, though, is that, yes, we do preach the gospel very, very well, and I'm not denying that. The problem is that sometimes we put such an emphasis on what we're saying that we fail to take into account how we're saying it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been really happy to keep running into guys over the past several years who have been very interested in getting back into like rhetorical studies, mm-hmm. and how to really construct these things, not just so that we're accurate, like you're saying, which is I think we've got that down, but how to make it accurate, reliable, memorable, emotionally moving if it's appropriate, all these sorts of things. And we can all, it's kind of like golf, right? You could have always hit it just a little bit better.
Right. Well, and I think that's an important thing to point out, like when studying these different resources too, is that we so often come to the task of preaching as this very like technical kind of thing. Like we focus on the content so much, but we forget that preaching in itself is persuasion, right? We are called to be persuasive. We are called to present the truth in a way that is alluring, in a way that is engaging, in a way that calls for, and don't misunderstand me when I say this, it calls for a reaction, right? You want people to go somewhere with your preaching, whether that be like, I want them to understand this better so that they can come away from this sermon and say, oh, I understand that doctrine a little bit more. Or maybe you're calling for some kind of response, like I want people to be better fathers or be better mothers or to engage in their daily lives what it means to be a Christian. And so because of that persuasive aspect to preaching, I think it's very helpful then to turn to all these resources that we have available, even ones that we're not aware of, as a way of thinking about how to go about that task. Because really what it comes down to, and I was thinking of this before I came on the show here, if you want to get very, very good at something, how do you go about doing it? Well, obviously you want to practice. Obviously you want to keep working at it. But often what you also want to do is to study those who have done it very well, right? That by imitating, by learning from them, by studying how they went about the preaching task, you'll be able to say, oh, okay, here's how I might be able to incorporate this into my own preaching, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I do know, I can think of a couple authors off the top of my head, like literature authors that I've read about, who in trying to write great literature themselves would just simply sit down and either hand copy or, typewriter copy out, the authors that they loved, so that they could get kind of the flow of the thoughts and the flow of the words and how sentences were constructed. So yeah, it's certainly imitation, right? One of the best ways to learn. Certainly one of the most New Testament ways to learn. So what are some, I don't know, how about some topics or some areas that you've found in some of your reading that might maybe not be highlighted so much in our general pastoral preaching training?
Well, that's a good question. I think it really comes down to a question of how do we approach the task of preaching? How do we approach the art of preaching? Like, what is it that we want to accomplish when we step into the pulpit? And we as Lutherans obviously have, very clear ideas of what that task is, and they're good ones. I'm not gainsaying any of them, but it can be very helpful to look at some of these other preachers, other traditions, if you want to use that kind of language, and to ask, well, how do they approach the task of preaching? How do they deal with speaking to their own generation? How do they how do they actively engage with their hearers in a way that makes them justly famous, justly remembered for their preaching? Obviously, within our own circles, we have, very clear examples like Walther or Luther or Gerhard or any of those preachers, and they're good ones. There's certainly ones worth studying. But it can really also be a question of, well, what made this particular famous preacher so effective at his preaching? What is it that, what can I learn from him? So, let's take one example. Chrysostom, right? John Chrysostom. What is it about Chrysostom that makes his preaching so effective? Well, obviously it's not just that he's called the Golden Mouth. It's, obviously he's called the Golden Mouth for a reason. But Chrysostom's strengths lie in his ability not only to unpack a particular passage, because he's the kind of preacher that goes verse by verse, at least in the first half of his sermons, but he's also the kind of preacher that is very effective at showing what all of these things mean. Obviously, he has his hobby horses. He tends to go off into talking about the relationship between wealth and poverty. That seems to be one of his favorite topics, and obviously you can do with that what you will. But he does it very, very well. And his way of applying his particular passage is usually very effective, very memorable, so that he is justly remembered through history as being the golden-mouthed preacher, even if he's not what we would call, strictly speaking, quote-unquote, Lutheran, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. So what sort of names or resources, or maybe like an era or something like that, have you kind of looked into the most, or is it pretty wide ranging? Or
I try to aim for all over, I guess, in my reading, and maybe it's worthwhile to kind of lay out what I would consider to be a valuable way of approaching this, or at least the way that I've approached it, and people can do with it what they will.
That'd be great.
So the first thing that I would suggest with this is that you approach it, first of all, by coming to what I would call the more theoretical end of things, to look at people who have talked about the very task of preaching, how to actually go about it. How does one preach? How does one present a sermon? How do you prepare a sermon? All those kinds of questions, that very theory-oriented kind of preaching, because that can be sometimes the most helpful for actually producing. But it will also lead into some of these other things, which we'll see going forward. One of the ones that I found to be the most helpful for this aspect of it, this more theoretical aspect, is a man by the name of John Broadus. I don't know how many people are familiar with him, but he is one of the founding fathers of what has become the Southern Baptist Convention. So he's kind of the one of the earliest and the moving forces behind that particular denomination. And he was also probably among its most influential for shaping how Southern Baptists actually preached, because he prepared in the late 19th century a fairly lengthy book called A Treatise on the Preparation and Delivery of Sermons. And in that book, he lays out what he considers to be the preaching task in a way that is very exhaustive. Like, he'll talk about the prerequisites to preaching, what it means for a man to become a preacher, what kind of things he needs to be. He talks about the actual preparatory work, working through the scriptures, working with the, actually laying things out. He talks about the structure of a sermon as he understands it. And he also, and towards the end of that work, talks about its actual delivery. Like, how do you speak in a way that's effective? Like, the physical aspects of speaking. And I find that book to be extremely helpful for me, if only because, it was so influential in the Southern Baptist tradition, but also because he's so thorough at what he says. And it's something that I think is very worthwhile to engage with, and maybe something that we as Lutherans can delve into in more length. Right.
Is it a pretty big or easy to find book at all? Would this be something someone could pick up on eBay probably, or maybe archive.org or something like that?
The book is old enough; it can be found for free online. It was also popular enough that it's been produced many times, reprinted many times. Be more careful if you get more recent publications, because it's generally abridged. More recently, I prefer the unabridged version, which is about 600 pages long, which again shows his thoroughness. And like I said, that can be found on the Internet Archive for nothing. So you could start reading it immediately if you wanted to do so. Something I also think is very interesting about his legacy, and something that maybe kind of endears me to him a little bit, is that he was, like I said, the leading figure in that tradition up until fairly recently. And the only reason why they've kind of moved away from him more recently is because of their increasing, I guess you could say, like, liberalism and wokeness that has unfortunately infiltrated that denomination. So, if the woke crowd doesn't like him, maybe there's something to be said for him, right?
Yeah. So would it have been a pretty like standard textbook then?
Very much
Pretty
so.
much is what you're saying?
Yep. It was the standard textbook for them up until very recently. That would have been like their Walther that every Southern Baptist preacher would have read.
Okay. What would be some points for either prep or delivery that you might want to just highlight to try to convince people to download this and read through the 600 pages?
Sure. Well, Broadus has an emphasis on, obviously he wants to be very well educated. Like he's got an emphasis on thoroughness. And he also has an emphasis on clarity. And I think that that's something that we, sometimes go off one side or the other, right? We say we either want to be so thorough and so, how do you want to say? We want to be so thorough that we want to get everything packed in there, and it ends up just kind of running over people's heads. But on the other hand, you can also have the overly chatty kind of approach to things where it ends up not saying a whole lot. And I think what Broadus tries to emphasize really well is that you don't have to pick one or the other. You can still be very learned and very thorough about the way that you're approaching the scriptures, while also speaking in a way that everyone's going to understand. And he has a saying, it's a little bit off color, so you'll have to forgive me for that if anybody's offended by that. But he has a saying that a preacher should read Butler, meaning Joseph Butler, and preach to the Negroes. And what he means by that is that you should be thoroughly educated, because Joseph Butler and his analogy of religion was the major theoretical work and apologetic work of the 19th century. Whereas being able to preach to all classes, even those who have very little education, and being able to be understood also by them while not sacrificing anything about what you're bringing to the table about preaching the Word of God.
Right, because if you preach to the learned, the unlearned can't get it. But if you preach to the learned can get it. Mm-hmm. So you might as well shoot for the one that goes for everyone, as opposed to, I don't know, sometimes showing off, possibly, right? Right,
exactly. Well, and preaching to the unlearned in such a way that he can understand it, but also that the learned is not going to be offended, right? You can be overly simplistic about things, and then you just kind of lose everybody. But to be able to strike that balance so that you're preaching to all classes of hearers is something that I think Broadus does very well.
So if his emphasis is on clarity so that everyone can understand it respectively, mm-hmm. Is he talking about simple sentences? Is he talking about clear outlines? Like, what are some of the ways that he encourages us to be growing in our ability to be clear?
Yeah, I think it would be, it's been a little while since I've reread him. I mean, I'll be honest. But I think he would emphasize all of those things, that you don't want to preach in such a way that your sentences are convoluted, because if something looks good to the eye, it's probably going to sound terrible to the ear. That's one thing that I found through my studies here too, is that what looks terrible to when you read it, because it's just like, why are you repeating yourself so much, is something that the ear delights in. The ear loves to hear repetition. It loves to have something to latch onto, because that's how it grabs hold, right? Whereas with the eye, you have the time to sit down and think about it and to carefully process it at your own pace, and therefore repetition becomes kind of boring. But you're speaking, and that's something that you want to keep in mind as you're speaking, is that you are, talking. It's okay to repeat yourself in such a way that people will be able to lay hold of your sermon and to understand what you're trying to say. I would also say that he's the kind of guy that would say, don't show off. Obviously, you don't want to say something just because you think it sounds clever. That's honestly vanity. and that's something you want to avoid. So speaking in a way that can be understood by all is a way that's also very humbling for the preacher, because it means you're taking your task as preacher very seriously.
Good. So that's Broadus. He wants us to be clear, educated, and thorough. Mm-hmm. And his work can be found pretty easy online. What other sorts of resources have you sort of found to be useful?
Yeah. So I think once you get through, well, I should also say one other nice thing about Broadus's work is that towards the end of that work, especially the unabridged version of that work, he has a very thorough annotated bibliography of similar sorts of works that were very common in the 19th century. And I think that can be very helpful if you're interested in not only reading Broadus in particular, but finding all sorts of other resources, especially because in the 19th century, there were all kinds of how-to sermon kind of books. And so there's no shortage of material if you know where to look for it. And Broadus is a good way of helping you to find that material. But I think
just real quick, I would assume maybe one of the things that's probably good about him for us to learn from is that, just going off of a solid assumption here, since I haven't read it, he preached in English.
Correct.
Right?
Yep.
So that's always something that's extremely helpful, I've found, is to find someone who actually is doing the job in the particular language that you're going to be working in, because otherwise, sometimes some things can get lost in translation or just, don't transfer very well between, say, German and English.
Absolutely. I would agree with that 100%. And learning to find preachers that work in your language, like originally in your language, like you say, is a tremendous benefit, just because there is a certain quality that cannot be brought over, even with a good translation. What is it that makes someone really effective in a particular language? I mean, it's all the allusions that he has. It's the way that he words things. It's the way that he structures his sentences. That's not something you can take over, right? You can reproduce the general meaning very, very well, but you can't reproduce how it was said. Which, of course, reminds me of the quip that George Whitefield once said about when they asked him about publishing his sermons. And he said that it was fine, only that it wouldn't have the thunder and the lightning. And I think that's exactly the point, right? A printed sermon is not the same thing as a living voice. It just can't be. So,
does he have strong opinions like some of us do about using a manuscript or not?
Broadus is, I think he's...
Or was that just probably kind of expected in his day that you didn't?
Well, honestly, what was expected in his day was that you didn't slavishly read. That was expected. But frequently the practice was to memorize, to prepare the sermon and to completely memorize it and therefore deliver it in that way. And obviously that has its faults too. But straight reading is probably not something that he would say that you should do. I mean, it should be a last resort kind of a thing. You should be able to at least deliver, even if it's just reciting what you remembered, so that you're engaging with the people.
Does his book give any example sermons, or would he have? I'm just going to assume there's probably collections of his preaching available somewhere.
Yes. Yes, there are collections of his preaching available. No, his textbook does not have example sermons. It's long enough as it is.
Yeah.
I think that's the easiest way to answer that. But that kind of leads me in then to the next little section that I want to talk about, though. Where do you find the examples, right? Where do you find the men to consider? Well, and I think the easiest way to answer that is to look to historical overviews of the task of preaching. People who have written about preachers throughout time, kind of looking at trends, looking at how did these preachers approach their subject, who are the famous preachers, that sort of thing. I find that sort of thing to be very, very helpful for finding, especially people that we're not aware of, right? And to that end, I would encourage that people would read a number of these overviews, and I'll give just a few here. Probably the most important one right now, and certainly the most thorough of them, if you want thoroughness, is Hugh Oliphant Old's 7-volume series, The Reading and Preaching of the Scriptures and the Worship of the Christian Church. Old produced this tremendous resource, I forget maybe a decade ago now? About 2 decades ago now, in the late 90s. And in it, he goes through preaching in every time period, from the days of the apostles down to the present day. And he talks about who were the leading figures in a given area, in a given time, and especially, at least for some of them, I'd say actually for most of them, he also will talk about their style, their sermons, in at least like a chapter's worth of detail. Like I said, this is a 7-volume set. The thing is like a foot of book on your shelf. It's huge. So, but what I found very, very helpful with that sort of resource is that you'd be able to say, okay, who are the most important preachers for, say, the apostolic period? Who are the most important preachers in the medieval period? Who are the most important preachers in, Reformation France? That sort of thing. If you're interested in those sorts of things and trying to figure out who is it that we can learn from outside our own particular tradition. Because the men that he talks about in this length are all pretty well known for their preaching. Like, that's what they were remembered through time. And even if it's someone that we're less familiar with, they were still famous, at least in their own day, for their preaching. And I think that can be very, very helpful. Do you want to add anything real quick? Or?
No, that's a pretty recent work then.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting.
Yeah, like I said, in the late 1990s, so right around the turn of the millennium. If you're not,
so is it sort of a series of small biographies, or does he include any of their, like, maybe snippets of their work, or?
Mm-hmm. It's a little of both. Mostly, if he only talks about the preacher himself, it's just a brief biography. But for many of them, he will also include an examination of a few of their sermons. Like, let's look at these particular sermons of, say, Augustine, and consider how it is that Augustine goes about the task of preaching, and what can we learn from Augustine as he goes about it. Obviously, Old is coming at this from, I believe he's Presbyterian, if I remember correctly. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. He has certain ideas about what he considers to be good preaching, and sometimes that can influence his judgments. But just the sheer fact that he's talking about so many people over these enormous periods of time can still be very helpful. So,
how do you go about finding, I mean, other than this great resource, but do you just kind of just look for different books at used bookstores, or how do you end up stumbling upon all this stuff?
Well, honestly, the individual preachers, I think it's really helpful to go to works like this, to go to a work like Old's resource, and to consider, okay, do any of these particular preachers catch my interest? Like, is the way that he talks about, Augustine or Chrysostom or, St. Bernard or something like that, is that something that catches my interest so that I can then go to finding more particular works? But that's usually how I've gone about it. Certainly, you could just go look for a book of sermons and start studying it. But unfortunately, there are just so many of them, especially the further forward in time you get, that it can really be helpful to go to a resource like this to be able to sort through them.
Right.
A couple others that I would include if 7 volumes sounds a little bit too intimidating for people. There is also Edwin Charles Dargan's 2-volume set, A History of Preaching. Dargan was a student of John Broadus and wrote this work especially after his death. Dargan also has very, very strong opinions about what he considers to be good preaching, and again, that sometimes influences the way that he approaches things. But it's a much shorter set, and it can be very helpful, again, just for finding those names. Dargan is a little bit more of a, here's the important preachers, here's a little bit of some thoughts on that preacher, move on to the next one kind of approach. So he's not as thorough as Old by any means, but he certainly covers a lot of the same ground. And if you want something even shorter, John Broadus himself wrote the Lectures on the History of Preaching, which is a 1-volume work, very, very short, kind of covers the big, big names, and that can be just something to have a starting point, right?
So what are some of the things that these guys consider to be great preaching versus not great? Like, I know they have hobby horses that they like to put out there, as you've said. So, like, what are some of their sort of hot takes on some of these things?
Well, they are, I want to say, they're thoroughgoing Protestants. And because of that, understandably, they're never usually very big fans of Roman Catholic preaching, for example. And I get it. I understand why. They also, especially Dargan and Broadus, want to emphasize, doctrine, which again, understandable. You obviously we're not against that sort of thing. It's just that they're not approaching this from here is a generic list of these guys. It really is a matter of, here are the big names, and maybe this particular one I'm not quite so fond of for these various reasons, but he is still important for the history of preaching. To use a real good example of this, Origen. Origen is a very controversial figure for in any circle, but he is undeniably critical in the history of preaching, because it is Origen who is the transition between the more topical approach of the apostolic period, where they don't really have a particular text that they're preaching on, to the more systematic, verse-by-verse kind of approach that we see going forward. So he's kind of the turning point in Christian preaching history. But of course, because of his own doctrinal hang-ups, because of his peculiar ideas, he is a polarizing figure. But if you're willing to look past those things and to kind of ignore those things, you'd be able to say, oh, okay, here's what I can learn from someone like him about what it means to preach through the Bible. Right?
Yeah, that's very helpful.
So,
go ahead. Where do you want to go from here?
Well, do you think that kind of covers that topic fairly well?
Yeah, I mean, this is quite a bit of resources already to look at.
Sure.
So we've got the sort of the theoretical end with Broadus's famous work. We've got the Old's 7-volume master class on the history of preaching and some other simpler ones. Mm-hmm. What other sorts of things would you recommend, or maybe even how to read these things responsibly?
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe the way to approach them, the historical overviews anyway, is to be willing to take them for what they are, right? To kind of look past their particular hang-ups, to look past their particular point of views, to be able to say, okay, here is some figures that I could potentially work with, even if it was some that I wasn't aware of before. And I think that sort of approach is actually very helpful in general, because we can become so focused on the what we're saying that we think only about that whenever we approach anything else, right? Even if someone is very, very good at preaching, because they say something that we don't agree with, our tendency is to say, oh, well, that was a bad sermon, right? Because it said something wrong. Well, yes, it is bad because we don't want to preach falsehood. But at the same time, we can still learn something about how they actually say what they say and still glean something from that. We should be able to stop and say, okay, he was right when in the way that he did this, even if I don't like his conclusion or even if I think he's wrong. And maybe because Old, for example, includes in his overview a discussion of Walther. He actually talks about early Missouri Synod preaching, and I forget in which volume that he has. And he doesn't have a whole lot to say about Walther. I don't know if you want to say that he's unimpressed with Walther or if he's generally, maybe it's just not his style of preaching. He doesn't give much of a space to early Missouri Synod preaching that we as Missouri Synod Lutherans might want. But that doesn't mean that we still can't learn from him and to still say, okay, what are his criticisms? What are his, how he's approaching these things so that we'd be able to say, okay, what can I learn from this? Right.
That's great.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm trying to think what are just some practical things that you've picked up from your studies in this thing that you've found to be, pretty helpful? Mm-hmm. Maybe some short rules, maybe some aphorisms, mm-hmm. things that maybe we make a lot of mistakes of. Mm-hmm. I know there's a lot of strong opinions with pastors I've talked to throughout certainly our church body and some others about things like, I don't know, using analogies and stories. And some people have very firm opinions about these things. Mm-hmm. What would be some of the things that you've really gleaned that have helped you?
Sure. Are you talking like generally speaking, or are you talking like from these historical overviews? I just want to make sure I understand where you're coming from.
Yeah, I mean, either. Just kind of in your wide reading of all these things, what have you found to be helpful?
Sure. I find that, and maybe this will kind of lead into my third section, but we'll get there in a minute, that when you come to preachers who emphasize, let's say, storytelling or a particular method of preaching, usually what you can find is that there are preachers who did it very, very, very well, and they were remembered for their preaching because of it. Going to people like that and studying how they did it can help us to avoid the pitfalls that usually go with that particular method. Because I think what's happening when we react against a certain method, if you will, is we're thinking of how it's so often abused. And we all know how it can be abused, right? We know storytelling preachers who stink. Right? That they're just up there, they're just telling personal anecdotes, and they might get around to the Bible, and it doesn't really mean much for anything. Obviously, that's not good. It's I guess you could say, a caricature of the method that is going to turn anybody off. Whereas if you go and you find these preachers who do it very, very well, while still presenting the truth of the scriptures very, very well, you can at least gain an appreciation for that method, even if you don't use it yourself. To use like one very good example of this, Walter A. Meyer in our own circles, the first speaker of the Lutheran Hour, was a story preacher. Absolutely. He loved all kinds of examples. His examples come from everywhere. He is constantly using these analogies to make his points. Whatever you might think of him as a preacher, he at least does it very, very, very well. And therefore, you can see by someone who does it well how the method can actually be a benefit, and you can at least be able to critique with a much fairer lens, when someone else is doing it. I think that would probably be one of the things that I think reading so widely like this, especially delving into individual preachers, can be very helpful for this kind of thing. You want to add to that before I go on?
So, I mean, basically what you're saying is one of the benefits to this study of all these other types of preachings and preaching in different eras is that, preachers have a rhetorical toolbox. Mm-hmm. And just because you've seen a whole bunch of people be really stupid with a hammer,
right,
doesn't mean that the hammer is worthless, right?
Right.
When you hit your thumb with the hammer, it's not the hammer's fault.
It's not the hammer's fault, yeah.
Right.
And I think because we so often blame the hammer.
Right. Yeah. So you have a third point.
Yes. And
that you wanted to, yeah.
This is kind of related to what we've been talking about just now, is that once you have the historical overview in mind, I think the last and the very natural step to take is to go to the individual preachers, to actually read their sermons, to actually study them in detail, to seriously and carefully consider what is it that makes them very, very good. Why are they remembered for their preaching? So that you can lay hold of that and actually say, here's something that I can at least appreciate, even if I don't use it myself. To go back to Origen, for example, I'm not a big fan of, heavily spiritualizing kind of interpretations. I think they can be very easily abused. However, Origen, despite all of his faults, is kind of an exemplar of that method. And so by studying how he goes about it, I can at least say, okay, I can now understand it, even if I don't agree with it, right? Or to go back to Walter A. Maier, I don't like to tell stories. I like to focus entirely on the Bible. However, because he does it so very well, I can now appreciate what it is that he's trying to do, and to understand how that can be done very effectively, especially with the constraints that Walter A. Maier was faced with. Take Chrysostom as another example. Chrysostom tends to have a little bit of a hobby horse. He tends to go back to his same favorite talking points in the second half of his sermons. However, because he does it so well, a lot of what he says is very memorable. And you can find that to be very helpful, even if you don't do it yourself. So I think it's just one of those things where by studying these guys who have done things very, very well, I can pull out these little gems, these little methods, if you will, that might be able to at least increase my appreciation, my understanding, even as I go about my own particular way of preaching.
How much of this research and reading and learning would you say involves really getting to know who your audience is, and then maybe would it be fit to buy maybe some of these volumes and then go through and see, oh, these people were preaching to people in similar positions to my people?
Sure.
Because I've read a decent amount of Chrysostom, mm-hmm. right? As you're sharing with us, he has his hobby horse. In my reading, it's usually like, hey, we need to take care of the poor. We need to talk to the rich about their excesses.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Maybe some of his suggestions simply aren't possible in our time. So maybe you don't get on that hobby horse. But is there any benefit to sort of comparing the audience of these people to our own audiences, if you will?
I see what you mean. And I would say yes, to a degree, because ultimately preaching is always something that is done in the moment. You will never be able to replicate the exact circumstances in which any sermon is preached. It doesn't matter if it's Luther, it doesn't matter if it's Walther, it doesn't matter if it was your predecessor. There's always something particular that we have to learn to speak to in this particular sermon. However, I think what you're saying is good in that we can see an analogy between our situations to be able to say, okay, he's speaking to a similar situation as my own, therefore I might be able to take some of what he says and how he approaches it to then address my own situation. But But the reason why I'm kind of hesitating on saying just like straight across the board is partly because I do agree with, what is his name? The guy who wrote A Little Town of Bethlehem. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. Philip Brooks. In his lectures on preaching, he once said that preaching is truth through personality. And I think that what he meant by that was that you are presenting the truth, you are presenting, what it is that God is saying, but in a way that involves you. And that's why it can never truly be replicated. That doesn't mean that he believes that it's, subjective or that truth is what you make of it. It's just that preaching is as much about the preacher as it is about what is preached. This is why Jesus makes such an emphasis on purity of living, right? If you are living contrary to what you preach, no one's going to listen to you. And rightly so. But when you preach the truth in a way that comes from you and from your own experience, that is what makes it so very effective. And that ultimately is not something that can be replicated ever again. You are speaking to this moment by the command of God to bring the truth of his word to this particular congregation in this particular time, in this particular location. There is an immediacy to preaching that can never be replicated.
So it sounds like, to go along with all these wonderful volumes you've suggested, probably one of the best things for each preacher to do is a very earnest and frequently occurring, just honest study of yourself.
Amen.
So that you can really know how to use whatever gifts you have in your toolbox the best.
Yes.
Right. Maybe you're not good at telling stories, so you just don't put them in.
Yes. I agree.
Yeah, that certainly would be a big battle to find out, but sounds pretty necessary to me.
Well, and I think especially when, how do you want to say, when you are looking at yourself and you're considering, well, actually, let me put it this way. When you are looking at all of these other preachers and you're going through all of this work and you are seeing how they did what they did, and basically how they preached and how it will benefit you, you will never be able to truly become someone else. And in fact, that's not the goal at all, right? What was the goal of artists who learned how to paint by copying the paintings of great painters? It was so that they could find their own particular style. What was the point of poets who copied and imitated the poems of great poets? It was so that they could now find their own voice to bring forward. Ultimately, if we think that we're going to become the greatest preacher that ever lived, you're not. I'm sorry, you're just not. Because, ultimately that's vanity. But by studying these great men, studying what they have to say, I can then look at myself and to say, okay, how can I now improve in the light of what this man did very, very well, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So kind of going back to the way you were speaking at the beginning about preaching as an art, I think there's a few popular phrases out there in other artistic fields, especially having to do with words, that all great art is just a variety of thefts, of stealing from other people and then taking it and making it into whatever your own thing is.
Sure.
So you don't necessarily have to invent it yourself, but you can kind of compile these things into a useful toolbox for your own voice.
Yes. Although I know what you mean and I agree. I would only say, and this just reminded me of another thing. This is like Lloyd Jones, a famous English preacher in the World Wars, once commented that we should never wholesale borrow. We should not just straight steal. Because I think that's the one thing you could take away from that is this idea that, I'm just going to do what Chrysostom did today, or I'm going to get up and I'm going to read Luther's sermon. No, don't do that. If nothing else, because the situation is too different, but also because, again, it needs to be you who preaches. It needs to be your voice, your understanding, your love for these people that moves you to say the things that you do.
Yeah, agreed. Is there anything else you'd want to share about all of this stuff you've done so much reading for?
No, I think I've kind of said my piece. Did you have any insights you wanted to throw in there, or?
No, probably just an expanded Amazon wish list now with these book recommendations. So, but no, I thank you very much for all of your for coming on to share some of these things with us, and I think this will be certainly helpful for me and hopefully for many other people as well. So again, Pastor Zelwyn Heide from North Dakota, and thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you.